Could I start by introducing our first speaker? All of us probably remember the tragedy that took place one evening in September 2012 in Melbourne, in Australia, when Tom Marr's wife, Jill, was walking home after an evening out with friends, and she was brutally raped and murdered. A person, Adrian Ernest Bailey, was arrested and tried for Jill's rape and murder. And during the trial, it was revealed that he'd had an extensive history of rape and violence against women. He was never held fully accountable. Arising from the tragic circumstances in which he found himself, Tom has it is a unique insight, a very personalised insight into the world of men's violence against women, and he is now working to highlight that issue and its prevalence. We must not lose sight of the point that was made by Rosamund, that a lot of the violence against women is instigated by people they know and they know well, but not all. There is that balance, but there is no safe space anymore. Initially, what Tom did was work in Australia and the state of Victoria to hold the parole board accountable. He had significant success in increasing transparency and accountability. He's now living and working in Dublin as a national advocate for the White Ribbon Campaign in Ireland. One quote from a comment piece that Tom wrote in The Guardian struck me as very, very forcible and showed me where his brain was. And I quote, "My wife Jill Meagher was murdered by a man who can easily be described as the sum of all evils. But we should not fall prey to the monster myth. The monster myth is too easy." Tom, we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I just wanted to kind of touch on some of the things that Rosamund said as well, just about impunity and how we use language. And also, I kind of wanted to touch on the issues of male engagement and how we can engage men properly and in the right way. Because often, engaging men isn't enough. It's how we do it and how men are and how men can self-examine about how they're socialized. And I just wanted to start by saying that kind of in the weeks, obviously my wife's death led me on this path to kind of really examine the root causes and the social causes and the social impunity that perpetuate men's violence against women. And I remember a few weeks after Jill's death, a journalist asked me, I think she asked me something like, "Where does all the violence come from?" And I couldn't answer her, obviously, because it's, number one, the complexity of the issue is beyond a soundbite. And if you ask any primary school teacher of mine, they'll tell you that I'm incapable of giving a bite-sized answer to anything. So today I just wanted to kind of try and approach sort of that question, where the violence comes from, and also kind of tackle some issues around the social impunity and obviously men's role in tackling gender-based violence. So just to illustrate something that Rosamund touched on about language in an everyday sense, I remember actually a couple of months before Jill was murdered, I was sitting in my apartment in Melbourne with Jill, and I was reading this essay by George Orwell called "England, Your England," and it was written during the war, and it was about sort of how we see the other in wartime. It's about how we sort of dehumanize the other in order to justify sort of violence and murder. And there was one line that I thought was really funny in amongst all this horror, and it was, "Every Englishman of working class origin considers it effeminate to pronounce a foreign word correctly." And I kind of looked at Jill and sort of repeated the line to her, and she kind of chuckled and said to me, "You guys still do that?" And I said, "Do what?" And she goes, "Well, when was that written? And I said, about 70 years ago. It was written during the war. And she said, you guys still use the word effeminate to describe something that's deficient or not good enough to be masculine or not good enough to be, not good enough to be manly. And I kind of was blown away by it because I thought I was just giving her kind of a soundbite. But I think that's interesting. I think my complete blindness to this until Jill pointed it out is a good example of sort of the invisibility of subtle forms of domination that we have in society. And I think the subordination of the feminine goes to the heart of men's fear of being perceived as feminine, and that's what we most strive to avoid as men. And structurally, of course, we can look at the lack of value and reward we place on traditionally feminized roles like care and domestic labour. But I think this goes to the very root of how we're taught to be men. And I saw a play very recently. It was called The Tricky Part. It was by a wonderful writer called Marty Moran, and it was about his own experience of child sexual abuse. And this one line struck me, and it kind of put a lump in my throat immediately. He was talking kind of as an 11-year-old about it the first time he'd experienced sexual abuse, and he said this line. He said, "If this must be what men and women do together. So if I do this with a man, what does that make me?" So I think Marty, as a victim of gender-based violence at the hands of another man, was silent by a culture that shames models of femininity in men. So he was shamed by the fact that he was feminized by his abuse. And often in the work I do and the work we do, we get backlash exclusively from men, which is unsurprising. But a lot of these men feel that their gender has been misrepresented, statistics have been miscalculated, and they're men who feel that highlighting the issue of men's violence against women axiomatically sort of denies the existence of male victims of violence. They're men who think that we paint all men as perpetrators. And I wanted to kind of just briefly explore how that thinking is wrong, first of all, and how it fails to grasp the structural nature of violence as a gendered issue, even when that violence is, even when the perpetrator and the victim of that violence are of the same gender. So these kind of anti-feminist misconceptions create this confused space where we focus on gender as this ahistorical binary as opposed to a spectrum of dominance and control within a patriarchal system that encourages that dominance. So in many ways, gender discourse and violence, when it's derailed by these men's rights groups, I don't like calling them men's rights groups because I think they're kind of a maintenance of power group rather than a rights group. It's often self-defeating. So like Marty in that play, they're the shame. It's actually the patriarchy that assigns the rigid gender roles that encourage shameful feminization of victimhood in both men and women. So the claims that these groups describe the same patriarchal structure I'm describing now, they simply decide to switch the gender of the perpetrator and blame feminism for it instead of the power imbalances that patriarchal systems of domination have infused into the very fabric of social life. So given the fact that half of murdered women are killed by their partner or former partner, given the fact that over 1 billion women globally suffer at the hands of men, focus on male perpetration and socialization is not a choice between male and female victims. And if there's anything you take away from this, I want it to be this, that men's violence is not just one type of violence amongst many other types of violence. Men's violence is a global and urgent fundamental abuse of human rights. And at the root of this is a structural power, and it's the fetishization of power and the global veneration of possession of that power that I wanted to address, along with specific inequalities that constitute forms of domination and impunity. So as the guardians of power across many intersections of society, men are the primary perpetrators of gender-based violence, which is both a manifestation of power imbalances and a deeply internalized relationship to violence, which teaches boys dominance and fails to provide them with emotional learning. And just as it teaches girls submission and an unhealthy respect for certain power dynamics. So even we men who feel uncomfortable with that sort of power have internalized it as a measure of a yardstick for masculinity in some way. So studies have shown that children as young as 6 have related to and internalized certain gender stereotypes and certain gender roles And in boys, unfortunately, that often includes violence. And as adults as well, I suppose this is so inculcated in us as adults that it's difficult to kind of differentiate between what is natural and what is learned behaviour. So, I mean, in societies where it's assumed that it's natural for women to be unpaid, nurturing caregivers, and it's assumed that men are supposed to be sexually aggressive, rational breadwinners who are, bad at doing dishes and picking up after themselves. It wouldn't be a huge stretch to suggest that men's violence, both against women and other men, is a natural consequence of having been born with the penis. Of course, that's a conflation of historical and socially structured power within the bodies of those who hold that power. And as a white, heterosexual, able-bodied, middle-class man in his 30s, I'm both a beneficiary of that power and a victim of the impunity it nurtures. And I'm not just a victim of that because my wife was murdered. I'm not only a victim of that because it makes me uncomfortable, but it suggests that I'm defined by violence and aggression. And even a rejection of that doesn't undo a lifetime of socialized masculinity or my silent complicity in certain male behaviors. So where does that impunity come from? So impunity and power are interrelated to the extent that they can become inseparable. On one level, the impunity is related to power itself in historic ideas about male ownership of women and ideas around dominant male sexuality. So the more we believe a constructed male gender to be natural, the more we believe that to some extent violence and sexual aggression is in our nature, and that social dynamics entitle us to be exempt from the perpetration of sexual invasion and microaggressions, as long as that sexual invasion fits into an individual man's personal idea of what constitutes appropriate behaviour. So a good example of that would be men who claim that women who are who complain about street harassment or catcalling have no sense of humour or are being sensitive about what is essentially a compliment. Again, the construction of that individual's conception of power is that he's the one who gets to decide what that woman finds comfortable or uncomfortable. I spoke to a woman recently who actually said that if she complained about every instance of street harassment, she'd be at the police station all the time. So the impunity that comes with participation and tacit collusion. So the more people who participate in the culture of normalization of sexual violence and microaggressions, the less likely it is to have punitive consequences, and the more likely it is to continue. Similarly, the more non-participants remain silent, the more we acknowledge it as unremarkable. This contrasts with how we perceive rarer forms of sexual violence, such as stranger rape. So the division between rape that is not tolerated and the relative impunity in which forms of domestic abuse and so-called non-violent rapes are viewed can be traced back to attitudes about our women, which is reflected in the stratification of abuse and sexual violence. The fact that Adrian Bailey, the man who raped and murdered Jill, acted with impunity for so many years comes more from how he chose his victims rather than from a brilliant criminal mind. The fact that his victims were women in prostitution had a bearing on the level of punishment, both socially and legally. So male ownership of women is rooted in the relativism in which we view men's violence. So we have degrees of impunity. So socially, for example, it's seen as far less acceptable to be violent towards another man's wife than to be violent towards your own wife. And similarly, it's seen as more acceptable to be violent against a woman in prostitution than your own wife. So the difference in that level of disgust is rooted in men's ownership rights over women. The top end of social unacceptability is violence towards another man's wife. This violence is affront to another man, and this is taken very seriously. A level of impunity up from that is a man's violence towards his own wife, which may be illegal and socially frowned upon, but it's often seen as a private matter, and it's often seen as not as problematic as the former. Finally, the man who's violent towards a woman he's paid for acts with almost complete impunity. The value we place on a paid service confers the ultimate transfer of ownership. So power plays into this again, and the construction of expected male power is often at odds with the lived reality of being a man. So many men who are unemployed feel powerless or have been marginalised by their race, social class or standing. This can coincide with a lifetime of masculine socialisation and historic entitlement that demands they appear powerful. And since the relationship between power and violence is so intertwined, these intersecting attitudes and beliefs often manifest in acts of violence, and understanding this is in no way excusing it. And the answer to this is not to sympathise with it. We need to change how we understand power. We need to change how we venerate power for power's sake. We need to teach our boys and men how to use power. We need to extract violence from power. We need to take the expectation of invulnerability from our model of masculinity. So simply engaging with men is not enough. We need to do it in the right way. And men, practitioners like me, need to be able to be in this space and do this in the correct way, and always think of the victim of violence. And I suppose this was illustrated to me very well recently, and I was trying to kind of encapsulate this idea of men's space in engaging with other men. And there was a moment I was stuck in a plane for 10 hours. I was actually grounded in Abu Dhabi for 10 hours, and I decided I'd stick on the in-flight entertainment. And I found this show called Flight of the Conchords. And in that show there's two characters, one's called Brett, one's called Jermaine. And they were having a bit of dialogue in one scene, and Jermaine turns to Brett and says, "You know, my dad was a women's rights activist." And Brett says, "Really, your dad, yeah? What about your mum?" And he said, "Mum? No, Dad would never allow it." So given that socialization and historic dominance, men in this space need to constantly self-examine. And I think it's possible for men in our situation to simultaneously be uncomfortable with their power over women while exercising that power as a reflex, and all the while sort of trying to dismantle it. So the temptation to take charge and handle things can be so strong in men that it can cross into these hero narratives, or the desire to be a protector, the desire to dominate and lead. And while it's well-intentioned that we want to surrender some of our privileges, our motivations for doing so should be as stakeholders and not protectors or saviors. And the danger of this kind of male engagement is that, number one, it reinforces the existing gendered power dynamics that contribute to systems of violence. And number two, it's couched in those old good guy, bad guy notions of masculinity, of saving and protecting women rather than changing those ideas of dominance and power. As stakeholders in gender equality, we avoid the paternalist idea that we're in a position of giving women rights that are already theirs inalienably. As stakeholders, we're in a position to examine how to separate men and boys from their relationship and their internalization of violence. As stakeholders, we're aware that this approach reduces men's violence against other men as well as women. As stakeholders, we come closer to a world where our sons are not defined by or inured to violence. Protector narratives also act as a barrier to real engagement. If a man feels like a hero for participating in an anti-violence campaign, he'd be very unlikely to examine those things that perpetuate the structural power imbalances that preserve male domination and men's violence. So by reproducing dominant forms of male control, we reaffirm violence as a tool of that dominance. And I wanted to kind of leave you with this quote from Bell Hooks that kind of always keeps me in that and on the right track with regards to men and male engagement. And it goes, "Patriarchal masculinity teaches men that their sense of self and identity, their reason for being, resides in their capacity to dominate others. To change this, males must critique and challenge male domination of the planet, of less powerful men, and of women and children. So we can't teach our children not to use violence while valuing power and dominance above all, particularly when violence is so often the primary tool of that dominance. This need to dominate is instilled particularly in boys who feel a failure to dominate equates to failure as a man. This needs to be changed with compassion and love, and I don't think it's solved by reinforcing the language and conceptions of dominant masculinity. So phrases like "real men don't abuse women," for example, are unhelpful because they reify this essentialist notion that there is such a thing as a real man. So too often campaigns targeted at men appeal to their sense of dominance and power. We all have power, but let's not equate that power with dominance or masculinity. Let's equate it with care and compassion. Let's not teach boys by reinforcing the narrative of men as protectors and perpetrators, but as men as participants in the march for equality and human dignity. We need to tackle the cultural covenances for power and control and the violence it creates. We need to create a generation of young Irish people who value humanity over power. We need to speak about and address these issues that are hidden in plain sight by silence, complicity, and arbitrary gender constructions that assign a definition of violence to men and boys who don't want it, don't need it, and instead could be our allies in our struggle against it. We need communities that value each other, not value power over each other. Thank you.